Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly Podcast. I'm here joined by ThoughtPat. I recently discovered your channel on Twitter, your YouTube channel on Twitter about a week and a half ago. And I thought, well, you're a young, well, more recent anarchist contributor. And I've rubbed shoulders with different anarchists over the years. Most of my viewers will know Keith Preston. And I thought, well, you have some interesting takes, and I wanted to sort of go through some of this. And we decided to talk today about, can anarchists, create work together? Basically, it's like herding cats, as the joke is. But before we even ask that question, anarchists have a habit of writing each other out of the history books. So, is Tolstoy not an anarchist, or is he an anarchist? Can you be a Christian and an anarchist? Are ANCAPs anarchists? And it ends up being that the first question is, who exactly are anarchists? So from your perspective, if you have a maximal definition, who would you say are anarchists?
It's kind of a difficult question to answer, really, but I tend to just go with the idea that if you identify with the label anarchist, then I will happily call you an anarchist, whether or not I think your beliefs on theory or your practice will actually lead to anarchistic conclusions. So I think ANCAPs definitely are anarchists. They believe in a society which facilitates individual freedom and the abolition of government, but the left-wing critique of ANCAPism is that it doesn't lead to the sort of society that they want it to lead to. From a left perspective, it's going to be the anarcho-capitalist rigorous enforcement of property rights is going to lead to a class system, which is going to be almost, if not more, exploitative and authoritarian as states are today. Now, that's not to say there's no reconciliation whatsoever with the left-wing anarchists and right-wing anarchists, because to me, all I think it takes is to point that out to them and to prove that, and then eventually, I think they'll end up coming to our side. That's just a very difficult process. In terms of Christian anarchists, I think it's definitely possible to be any kind of political ideologue whilst also holding religious views. It's up to the individual to try and marry their views with their ideology, I guess, their religious views with their ideology. That's probably going to depend on their interpretation of the Bible. But in terms of Christian anarchy, they will probably say, well, there's one master, and that's God. But anarchism is more about abolishing self-imposing hierarchies within human societies, and it's got nothing to do with anarchism as in terms of like rejecting God and all the rest of it. But that, again, that's going to be down to the individual on that. I might question that notion and say, is it really anarchy if you're letting someone else determine your actions and determine what is good and bad for you and all the rest of it? But that'll be on the back burner of discussions to be had over a cup of coffee. I'd still say they're anarchist nonetheless.
All right. Now, would you consider, how would you define, so for at least practical purposes, groups that would be considered anarchist adjacent that you would consider working with in this broader attempt to organize anarchism, but would not, strictly speaking, be anarchists?
They wouldn't. Hang on. So they wouldn't, strictly speaking. Oh, I see. So I think maybe if you're like a libertarian socialist who is in favour of workers' associations being independent of some government that may exist, or what they'll call a government. They'll say, oh, they can choose whether or not to accept this government's laws. Which I think is a funny kind of law, but those kinds of people do exist. I'd be willing to work with those. But if you're a sort of socialist who wants there to be a state at all, who and that state is going to enforce its laws no matter what they are upon the entirety of the population, no questions asked, then I'm afraid we are political enemies.
Right. So it would seem like that this is a subtle distinction, but I think one that needs to be made, and I want to see if you agree with this. The fundamental dividing line between, say, the anarchist and, say, anarchist adjacent on one end and the non-anarchist on the other is, what is your view of the state? Because one could envision somebody who is either indifferent or hostile to the state, but still not an anarchist. Again, Leo Tolstoy might be a good example of that. So someone like that, while not strictly speaking an anarchist, takes a position similar enough to the anarchist position on the state that that's someone that this hypothetical anarchist federation could do business with. Well, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's fine, so long as the group they're working with isn't imposing their wills upon other groups that have very little to do with them. It's going to depend on the actions of that group, I suppose. Like you could perhaps say that some kind of radical movement in Saudi Arabia is anarchist adjacent, although they don't identify as anarchists. But as soon as they start like imposing some kind of radical version of Islam upon its citizens, then I'd probably say that would be the line we draw them on. Like, for example, if Palestinian freedom fighters ended up turning on their own citizens, turning on women and saying, well, you need to be tied to your husbands and things like that, I'd object to that, for example.
All right. So then now you had already mentioned the sort of in-house disagreement between the, say, ANCAPs on the one hand and more classic, like left libertarians or left anarchists on the other. Now, in any sort of, now we get to the question of can anarchists work together? So I guess the first question is, what are the sort of things that are, given that there are going to be different substantive outcomes if we take each one of these to their logical conclusion, and people are going to say, well, in the long run, these aren't really friends at all. Whether that's true or not, that's what I think people are going to say. How would we go around sort of transcending, if you will, those divisions and find the, quote, common ground that would be necessary?
Well, it's pretty simple. We literally read and study the theories of our adjacent groups. So I've put a lot of my time into looking into ANCAP theory. There's a video where I go over that and I sort of see whether or not some nuggets from ANCAP theory can be compatible with like left-wing versions of anarchism. I think there's quite a few, more than ANCAPs are willing to accept. And simple things like just focusing on I'm talking about ANCAPs here. So our agreements with ANCAPs would be opposition to the war on drugs, opposition to invasive police forces, opposition to particular government regulations which are in favour of corporations, so like corporate welfare, things like that, opposition to foreign invasions, the military-industrial complex, etc., etc. So there's a lot of common ground there that we share with ANCAPs. So if there was any kind of across the aisle movement, which included libertarians of all walks against particular aspects of the state which we all disagree with, then I think it would be a bit silly to turn down a collaboration there. Same goes for like Marxists who will join hands with the anarchists in terms of like strike action or, generally supporting workers against corrupt and crony bosses. That's what the whole left unity idea is about. But we have to realize exactly where our differences are going to be. And obviously with the ANCAPs, it's about rigid private property norms. So if you're going to have a federation of anarchists which views expropriation as a valid means of achieving anarchism, and I think that's going to be most Western groups nowadays, then ANCAPs are going to struggle to find a home in that, aren't they? Because obviously we go against one of their key policies, which is defending private property. So the only way we can work together, so to speak, is to try and hash out the philosophical differences between ANCAPs and left-wing anarchists and really get to the meat of the issue, which is private property. Why is property justified? Is it justified? What's the alternative, etc., etc.
Right. Now, even within the sort of family of left anarchist positions, and arguably the political left as a whole, there's the sort of why does my revolution have to wait for your revolution syndrome, which leads to a lot of left-wing movements devolving into infighting and recrimination. How would you envision an anarchist federation dealing with that problem?
Anarchists aren't terrible for that kind of thing. I'll give you an example where Malatesta, quite a famous anarcho-communist, he gave an article in his paper L'Agitazione. Hang on, I'm probably butchering the Italian there. He gave an article in his newspaper talking about why he calls the wider anarchist movement a type of anarchist socialism and not anarchist communism. And he specifies that exactly not all anarchists are going to be anarcho-communists. Some are collectivists, some are mutualists, etc. And he was very much in favor of a position like my own, where we allow alternative models of organizing workers' associations to exist. Like, I expect an ANCOM will understand, anarcho-communists, to understand that if a company or a group of workers want to set up a workers' cooperative and just trade their products with a free currency, that they wouldn't try and obstruct that. What the communist is doing, the anarcho-communist is trying to do, is make markets unnecessary. So by encouraging people to engage in redistributive efforts to make the market unnecessary. That is their aim altogether, to try and convince people to act and behave communistically. And I think as long as we have that kind of, pan-anarchist sentiment, as in, if this group of workers want to organize this way or this group of workers want to organize that way, then I think we can find some kind of compromise based on like a diverse range of models being implemented within similar territorial sects.
All right. So with the set of objectives, there would probably be an ordered hierarchy of the most important to the least important. Well, how would you envision those lists of policy objectives being ranked?
How would it be done? Well, it'd be done according to the federation in question. And if different federations, they come up with different tier lists, if you will. That's been the case in any anarchist society in the past. There have been multiple different federations and trade unions with their own agendas and this, that, and the other. As long as they respect the freedom of other workers to work towards their own goals, then without violating particular thresholds, and those thresholds again are going to be quite subjective, which is can sometimes be confusing, but they seem to get along well enough. It depends really, because in Ukraine, for example, the Black Army, all the rest of it, Makhno, etc., they exhibited a variety of models of workers' association. So some areas, particularly in industrial areas, there was more of a Proudhonist, mutualist model going on. In the agricultural areas, there was more libertarian communes and things like that. So it's really dependent on how the workers on usufruct property or on the land which they use for the workplaces they occupy, how they wish to interact with the wider community. It's going to be up to them.
Okay. So then how would they be, these different independent federations that are of course subunits of this broader confederation? What would be the organizing body or principle that would sort of tie all these groups together to organize them along a common mission?
I don't think there will be. I don't think that. I mean, Proudhon gave a pretty critical essay on, put section of his book. Was it a book or was it an essay on the idea of revolution in the 19th century, where this idea of association and confederation for the sake of it isn't really needed, as long as you have a group of workers or groups of workers working towards their own objectives, to their own goals. They can work together where they think their interests align, or not work together when they don't think that's the case. It's up to them. It depends on whether or not they want to.
Okay, so basically, what you're envisioning is a sort of extreme development of benign neglect.
Kind of.
Now, obviously, okay. Let's assume that these groups do say the common defense, for example. Let's say they're trying to do some labor union organizing, and then there's strikebreakers are brought in and the police are brought in, and of course one federation won't be enough, and they'll send out the call, and others will be like, yeah, we'll help you out. Now there will be a higher level of organization at that point. Now it's again contingent. It's contingent upon this current crisis. But how do you envision that working together? Because it's difficult to see them all acting independently without coordination being very successful at defeating the corporate bosses in this particular context.
So what the socialists in Catalonia did when they had this exact same problem, that problem being the Spanish Civil War, they acknowledged that this wasn't just anarchists, these were people across the left generally. They acknowledged the necessity to establish a specialized organization dedicated to dealing with that one particular issue, which which accommodated people from different sects, different schools, etc. So what the CNT and others did, they set up something called the CCAM. Now, I unfortunately don't remember exactly what that acronym stands for, but there's a video I give on. Well, I give you a video that mentions that. It's my video on law. And what they effectively did was set up this specialized organization, which only focused on the war effort. And that had representatives from the CNT, the POUM, the UGT, etc. And that was how they just agreed to adhere to the arbitration of that particular unit. Now, once the idea or the aim was for once a civil war was done away with, for that to just be abolished. It's become surplus to requirements. And I think something similar would happen in similar circumstances. In fact, we see it now. BLM is one of them. BLM is just a collaboration of various groups coming together under a united platform, a platform by which they can get behind. So is anti-fascist action, but to a less organized degree.
All right, so this is obviously the one dispute that everybody's going to think of, and just to get out of the way, let's say that there's some ANCAP factory owners that are complaining that the anarcho-communists and libcoms are organizing union activities on their property, and they're threatening to call in strikebreakers. So, assuming there's a third anarchist arbitration party that exists to solve such disputes, how would you imagine that dispute being addressed?
The way I would imagine it being addressed is the ANCAPs being ignored and the property being expropriated, because unfortunately, on this idea of property, where you have one side saying it needs to be absentee owned or owned by whoever bought it, and then you got the other side which generally agrees on the premises of usufruct ownership. That is a irreconcilable contradiction between those two groups. So it's not something that can just be arbitrated there and then. That will necessarily lead to conflict, and that's why I say, even though there's a lot of things I can agree with on ANCAPs, they are still political opponents at the end of the day.
All right. So with these sort of caveats already stated, let's say that there is some higher organization that's been created to do some sort of direct action or whatever to fight against, say, entrenched capital in the state, which then serves to organize all the other units or confederated cells within this anarchist movement. What's obviously you could say that, well, some strategies they're all going to be tried differently. Each one's going to be different, but there's going to be some that are more effective than others. And over time, in all likelihood, those that are more effective will rise up the ladder to the decision-making process, such that that's the one that most of these people are going to use. We don't. Okay, so that's that. I'm not asking you to predict what would happen, but what do you think would be those kinds of strategies that would be most effective, that would rise to the top as sort of normative for this decision-making process?
So are we talking just in terms of the daily running of society or a particular goal?
Right, we're talking about a particular goal. So, right, this is quote unquote before the anarchists established their society, and they're fighting against the state and corporations, and they're competing over which strategies to use.
So, are we talking about strategies in terms of achieving anarchy?
Well, yeah. So at the very least, in any given geographic area, right?
Yeah,
I don't know how big you want to cast the net, but let's just say for any given geographic area, the goal is to abolish the state and to abolish entrenched capital. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, Connecticut, whatever. What strategies do you see being used, on the ground? How would they, day one of organization, what does that look like?
I'll admit it's not something I've given a lot of thought to, but if I'm going to just give my initial reaction to the question, the first thing I imagine, well, the one that's been implemented most recently in like the late 20th century was intentional societies rising out of squatters movements. So, for example, we've got Exarchia in Athens, and we've got Christiania in Copenhagen, and I've been there. And we've got we had the Chas movement in Seattle. We had the Chas movement in Seattle that tried to establish itself, but it didn't work. We've had those kinds of intentional societies. I think they have limitations, severe limitations, geographical limitations being one of them. The attraction of people who are not really dedicated to some kind of long-term plan, but are just there for the good vibes, the partying, and the camping out in tents, all the rest of it. The sort of cringe that led to the demise of Chas. Those societies attract those kind of people and that kind of behavior, which is annoying. And they don't really grow. They don't have this. Once they have their territory, they tend not to grow. If anything, they end up losing ground to the local government. So, in terms of how a permanent good strategy would, what kind of strategy would lead to a permanent shift to anarchy? I imagine. Well, I go with what Kevin Carson says. Really, it's going to be a gradualist counter movement, and what I mean by that, it's going to involve organizing people into their own federations, and those federations thus taking up the responsibilities of the government. So, for example, instead of relying on welfare funds, the aim is to have federations be able to provide mutual aid instead of the state. The aim is to eventually have federations be able to provide security instead of the state. The aim is to have cooperatives become the dominant means of the dominant mode of production, for example. How exactly that's going to pan out, and if violence is going to be a big part of that, I don't know exactly. I can't exactly say this strategy is wonderful and this strategy is going to be employed by all, because it's not going to be employed by all. It's going to be employed by many, many different people, many different groups, acting almost ad hoc. I don't think you can plan these things. I don't think you can plan revolutions. All you can do, really, is build counterpower, similar to what Gramsci was talking about. I know he's a Marxist, but you're talking about expanding federations, expanding tenant unions, workers' unions, the cooperative sector as far as you can, which prepares itself for the inevitable collapse of society, or the inevitable collapse of the state.
So maybe I should rephrase it slightly. What mechanism would be the means by which whatever strategy is chosen is chosen?
Simply, direct action, like people doing it. So if you have one group of people saying, right, propaganda by the deed is the way we go, propaganda by the deed is where we talk about terror attacks, assassinations, things like that. This was a popular movement in the early 1900s. It didn't work, and it effectively made anarchism a lot less, a lot less popular than it was. Another wave was syndicalism, and that was through using the trade union movement to spearhead some kind of popular uprising. That didn't really work, didn't pan out as well as people liked it to. It's literally just going to be, it's just experimental. It's all it is. It's just experimental. Different federations will try different things, and they'll get different outcomes. And it'll just be one day, one strategy will work. You don't know until you've done it. There's no way you can say, right, this is the strategy that's going to work until it works. So we're just going to go through cycles of trying and trying and trying until we get the right formula, which just so happens to work, and then it works.
Okay, so correct me if I'm misreading this, but the way I hear you saying it is, so whatever organization is tasked with this anarchist federation defense of workers on the factory floor, and there's all these different federations competing for what they perceive to be the best way to achieve those goals. It won't be that this organization says, well, okay, well, now we've come to the idea of what we want to do. You all got to get in line now. Rather, what it seems like you're saying is what you envision happening is whatever that strategy is, it's just going to be what everybody ends up doing at a certain point because they've all chosen to do that because they believe it to be the most effective.
Not quite everyone doing it. It'd be a group of people doing it, proving that it's effective, and other people following suit.
Okay. Well, yeah, but what I mean is it's more of rather than having orders from some sort of higher organization telling them to do it, it's more like, but because it is successful, it's convinced the other federations to then go along with it. And to the extent there's any uniformity of action, that's how you would envision that uniformity of action arriving.
Yeah, and that's off the just me thinking on the spot there. That's my answer. Yeah, I haven't done a great deal of research into practice and strategy. I've been mostly focused on economics and how societies could possibly work, how society could possibly facilitate laws and stuff. But strategy hasn't been the forefront of my focus. But those are my immediate reactions.
All right. Now, you had mentioned, Carson, and the idea of basically sniping services from the state, and you mentioned mutual aid. So how would you envision anarchists sort of, for lack of a better word, outcompeting, say, state healthcare?
Well, by setting up cooperative hospitals and providing them. That's all. That's just all it is. People falling out of favor with private healthcare, well, that's the thing in America, falling out of favor with the NHS in Britain, and there's many reasons to do so. The NHS is a shambles of an organisation. It kills quite a lot of people because of its disorganisation and its dysfunctionality. But I think healthcare is probably going to be one of the last things these federations going to be able to do, because obviously healthcare requires quite a lot of qualification. Let's say it requires a lot of resources. It requires a lot of money, and it requires a lot of expertise, and that is going to probably be one of, as I said, the last thing that the anarchists will take over doing. But it'll end up doing it eventually.
All right, so let's move to this question then. Yes, I mean, I would agree that a lot of these things are very capital intensive, and of course, anarchists throughout history have always struggled with lack of access to capital. But not just lack of access to capital, lack of the ability to transfer capital throughout the federation to those that need it. So how would you envision that happening?
A mutual bank. Mutual banks.
Could you explain what a mutual bank is?
A mutual bank is a bank which is owned by its customers.
Okay, and then they just put, but would there be money or currency, or what medium of exchange would be used?
There'll be currency. People put their money into the bank. The bank can give loans, but at a minimal interest rate. The interest rate will cover admin costs and some money to put back into the pool for further investments. I think a mutual bank, or as Proudhon called it, the People's Bank, would be a decent start. So if federations began being very active in setting up banks, mutual banks and all the rest of it, I think that would be a great start.
And then the mutual banks would then use that funding to then capitalize their federations?
Yes, yeah. And don't forget that the mutual banks themselves would be owned by the members, who themselves are also members of the federations.
Right.
So it's like almost like a bank of the federation. You know what I mean?
So then what about exchange of capital between federations? So let's say that, one federation is dealing with strike breakers in an abusive corporate situation, and another group is, pretty easy. They don't have any real problems going on. And, then the general consensus is, well, you should, all of the Spanish Civil War or something, right? Go volunteer over there to fight that particular threat. How would that be? How would that capital be transferred or facilitated?
Well, if a federation hasn't got any problems on its hand, it would have no reason to exist. So you wouldn't have a federation with no problems on its hands.
Well, okay, not that problem, and a problem threshold that is low enough that it has surplus resources.
Right. I don't think there's any objective grounds for saying, look, we're going to enforce redistribution on every federation. It's just going to be based on like appealing to any given group of workers to say, look, this is necessary. Contributing to what we are doing here is necessary to maintain your freedom, maintaining your just your freedom, I guess. Convincing those people to engage in an effort which will secure their interest down the line.
Right. Okay. So maybe a better example to illustrate the problem I'm trying to develop here is, let's say there's an actual armed invasion. You know, certain part of the country, you know, UK or America, whatever, has developed an anarchist breakaway republic or something like, you know, Catalan. Mm-hmm. But then it's getting invaded. But it's not being invaded all across the board. Only certain federations are getting attacked. Well, other federations that aren't directly on the front lines or are in a different part of the country may not feel the need or the pressing need to help those that are actually being attacked. But then the risk that I see developing is a kind of divide and conquer strategy where each federation by itself isn't strong enough to resist the invader. And if there's no pressures or to get them to work together to stop them at the front, right at the headwaters of this invasion, then they're just going to be defeated piecemeal. Is there any mechanism that you could envision that would avoid that?
Yeah, you make the exact point that you just made then to them. And then they'll either choose to act on it or not. If they don't act on it, then it's likely that they'll be crushed through divide and conquer. If they are aware of the strategy of divide and conquer, then I imagine that they'll be more than willing to provide aid to defensive forces who are effectively on the front line, so to speak.
So I guess then a related question to this then is, when you're making a pitch to convince other members of other federations, there's a certain minimum level of education that we're assuming that they ought to have. That way they can understand the nature of the threat. So how would you see whatever that sufficient level of education is, such that they could reasonably see all these, you know, threats and say, okay, well, it may not be a threat for me today, but it'll be a threat for me 10 years from now. So I'll help you out. How would that education be sort of organized and done?
Well, either through independent free schools or through independent research and education. Like, you're asking me how people would learn stuff.
Well, it's not so much how they would learn stuff, but that it is that, but also like what would they be learning? So that's really a pedagogical question. What are sort of the preconditions of education such that you have an educated enough base to understand these kinds of threats?
Well, I imagine people would want to understand those kinds of things and would pass on the value in understanding those kinds of things. So if you talk about just geography or geopolitics, you would have quite easily groups of people setting up schools whereby that kind of geopolitical awareness, it's not the best word in the world, but that kind of thing, that geopolitical awareness is a valuable valuable discipline to understand. And because it's valuable, and because you're obviously stressing that it's valuable, I think people will value it and will contribute to it and its propagation.
Okay. A related question was in 1967, the Canadian journalist Peter Jay interviewed Chomsky. And one of the things he talked about was defense of an anarchist society. So, of course, the current levels of technology and current military conflicts are radically different than those that Chomsky was forced to talk about. But one of the things that comes up in the Peter Jay discussion is, Peter Jay said to Chomsky, it's difficult to envision how an anarchist community could defend itself against an invasion of a conventional force if it doesn't have a hierarchical military in a similar fashion. Mm-hmm. And then Chomsky said, well, there's one of two things that will happen. Either it turns out that isn't actually needed and there is some libertarian solution that could be used to defeat a centralized military force, one that he's not aware of yet. Or it could be that, well, you do need one, and the best way to then fight back would not be to fight militarily because you'd be crushed, but to appeal to the working class of the invading country. That's what Chomsky said. Now, in light of, say, more recent military affairs like, the Kurds in Rojava and Syria and elsewhere, how would you answer that question that Chomsky was given?
So in terms of organizing military defense in general, I gave a comment before on standing armies. Depends on the region. It's going to depend on the region, depend on the territories. Some territories, like especially if you're in Ukraine now, you're going to want to have a standing army. Most people will value a standing army. I think they'll voluntarily fund a standing army quite easily. If you're in Ireland, but there's no threat of foreign invasion whatsoever, I find it difficult to justify a standing army, and so does the Irish government. That's why we don't really have one. But I, in terms of national defence or territorial defence, if you don't like the word national, all you need is people, weapons, ammunition, vehicles. Obviously, skilled people and experienced people and people with particular qualifications, etc. You don't need a monopolistic state to coordinate it all. And we've seen in the past, although, yes, unsuccessfully, but unsuccessfully against insane odds. So a part of Ukraine, not the full territory of Ukraine, but just like a quarter of a country a quarter of the size of Ukraine with no real industrial development, taking on the brand new Soviet Union. Well, if you swap them around, if you have the Soviet Union occupying the territory that the Anarchists did, and that the Anarchists now with the territory and the capital of the Soviet Union did, well, the Anarchists are going to win, easy. In terms of things like national defense, we see volunteer militias overthrowing governments everywhere throughout history, throughout the world and throughout history. The American Revolution perhaps being the most famous one. That was one where a volunteer force effectively defeated one of the largest colonial powers on the planet. And that was not done through conscription. Neither was the French Revolution. That wasn't done with conscripts. So the capacity for volunteer armies, if people are infused enough by the cause, they'll donate, they'll sign up, they'll do what they do. We've even seen in Britain people going off to Ukraine to fight. They're not even Ukrainian, but they're going off to fight illegally. They're pretending to go on holiday to Poland and then crossing the border from there. And that's just for a war in Ukraine. So if Britain was invaded, I think a lot of people would be quite happy to sign up and fund it.
Right. So I see that there seems to be a kind of needle that's being threaded here, because on the one hand, what the Anarchists and the Anarchist Federation is going to want to preserve is, maximal autonomy of choices for individuals. But there are also what we might call common good issues, like, say, defense or education or whatever. And then you're going to have to balance it where you can convince enough people that it's in their interest to do that, to then, forego some of their immediate interests for these common good interests, but on a totally voluntary basis. Now, while I wouldn't object in principle that could happen on small scale, I think we see this with things like fraternities and clubs a lot. What I think we don't see a lot of examples of, and what I'd like to ask you is how you could overcome that hurdle of a more large scale effort like that. Because again, if we look at defense, which seems to be where a lot of historic anarchist societies flounder, it's really not as easy as it sounds to convince all of them to get on the same page.
Well, it was never a problem about convincing people to support the war effort. In Catalonia, there was no problem with that whatsoever. Everyone was on. Well, the vast majority of people were very much on board with the war effort, whether they were anarchists or not. The problem was literally just capital for them, as in they all they had was that little corner of Spain and the nationalists, effectively through defeating the Republicans itself. The Republicans themselves, statists, who also lost the war, and then swallowing up their capital and then using it all on Catalonia.
Well, but wouldn't it be the case, though, that since Catalonia was one of the most industrialized part of Spain at the time, along with the Basque Country, that they technically had the upper hand? The territories that were immediately claimed by Franco were largely agricultural.
Well, it's not the only industry in Spain. I can't give you a very in-depth analysis of Spanish geography and the Spanish Civil War, but the Catalonia itself is still tiny compared to the rest of Spain.
Right, but I guess what I would say, though, is that the sort of like mouse versus the elephant. If we look at like England in 1588 against the Spanish Empire, the mouse can beat the elephant. The real question I'm asking is, anarchism, there's a threshold that anarchism needs to cross through, both theoretical and practical, where it can be cohesive enough that is a managed or budgeted for risk in a way that I don't think it's been done thus far.
No, you're correct, yeah.
And I guess that's what I'm trying to do, is trying to see what would, because I ask a lot of anarchists this, anarchists I consider friends, and it's really hard to get even a cogent theoretical answer.
You're not going to get one, because a cogent theoretical answer where they're confident enough it's going to happen would imply the use of state violence, wouldn't it? Because you say, right, this is a plan, this is what we are going to do, this is what you are going to be part of. Whereas it contradicts the whole nature of anarchism.
Well, I guess this is an interesting question then. With the use of force, now we could also say, okay, so the state, I think the definition you would use is a monopoly on the use of force. And so the state can say, well, look, we have a monopoly on the use of force, and we're just going to force you to do this. Now, if we say that, well, but is that the only kind of force that matters? Or rather, to rephrase it, are there kinds of force that an anarchist would be okay using? So, for example, Chomsky's mentioned, a parent pulling a child out of the road. That's use of force, but it's one that's justifiable because it was used to protect the child's life. Could we envision some sort of intermediate institution that was using that as a justification to impose some sort of military discipline on an anarchist community for its protection?
No.
Or if it's too close to the state that it would never even fly?
No, I wouldn't justify through even through what Chomsky was talking about. Even using Chomsky's analogy, I wouldn't justify a self-imposed military-industrial complex. No. Right.
Okay. So then, would there be military discipline or like union discipline? So if you're on the picket line and you decide.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. So there would be imposed discipline there. So I'm guessing
it's imposed because you're voluntarily a part of the army, right?
Right, because yes, okay. So let's say that these anarchists have joined the Anarchist Defense Federation force. Mm. Then at that level, how would this problem be solved? Or even on a theoretical level? So all these people have volunteered for this group. They're not being coerced to stay there. But how are those assets used? In the optimal way that the mouse could defeat the elephant.
I don't know if I can get. I don't even know if I can begin to give an all-encompassing answer there. I need someone to work with.
Sure. Oh, you need more to work with, you said?
I need more to work with there.
I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. So let's assuming that these are anarchists. So back to my earlier question with how would sort of strategy be organized so that all these disparate anarchist militias would work together for some sort of a common goal? Mm-hmm. Because it seems that where they flounder, like in Mexico, Mexico as well, the Mexican Revolution of 1911, the Russian Revolution, and the Spanish Civil War, it's crossing that Rubicon where they have a hard time getting there. Yeah, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that historically it's been very difficult for them to overcome that. How would you envision that being done? Where there's a coherent policy that they're all pursuing for this particular objective?
I'd say the policies that I'd say the standard that the Black Army and the CCAM set were adequate. So So in terms of, right, you're part of this army, you can vote on your commanders. The commanders themselves then formalize the strategy, and they determine where the resources go and just as long as the army can function however it likes internally, just as long as it's democratic and as long as it's voluntary.
Right. One of the backing up to an earlier point about the distinct federations organizing their own, banks and capitalizing their economies in their own way. And let's say that, there are those that get wealthier and more powerful than others for a whole host of factors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one problem that one could envision rising is that they then decide, because of the difference in resource distribution, that those federations that for whatever reason happen to be more wealthy might then decide to impose a new state apparatus because they can then leverage their capital accumulation over everyone else. How would that internal threat be hedged against?
Well, let's think about what the incentives are for a federation to suddenly impose state authority. What does state authority look like? Well, state authority is a monopoly in violence. So now the federation has to find an interest in managing everyone's affairs within a given territory. That's the state. What are the incentives for to do so in the first place? Well, I don't know. One, it's a very expensive obligation to set for yourself, because now you're saying, okay, as a member of this federation, I'm not only now paying for my own protection, but I'm now paying for the protection of everyone else, the people who are unwilling to have that protection. Oh, we can have taxes. Well, if to impose taxes, you need a massive police force. To have that massive police force, you need to have massive training programs. You need to have conscription, maybe of some form, and it's a lot of hassle, let's say, to recreate the state. And this is why it doesn't really happen in anarchist communes. It doesn't happen because there's no real incentive to do it.
The ones that currently exist, but there are those that either. Well, okay, this is an example I think eminently plausible. One of these more wealthy federations is neighboring a state which says, well, look, we could invade them and plunder them because it's actually worth our while now to loot and pillage what they have. And in a state of emergency, they say that the revolution is under threat. They're going to have to bring in emergency measures to make sure that we don't get conquered by the reactionaries and everybody else. And these other federations over there aren't really paying their fair share for the defense. And if they were, we could probably win. A kind of like Bonapartism.
So you've got an anarchist society whereby the fact it's an anarchist society exists in the first place is because you've got quite a lot of people who believe in anarchism, don't believe in this idea of state force being imposed upon them. And now a federation has suddenly decided that it wants to be the state and impose its force upon them. The federation in question has now effectively declared war on its allies.
Well, yeah, no, I'm not saying that's not the case, but how would one go about hedging against that?
Well, you resist it.
Well, I mean, before it
happens, we talk about the incentives, right? So you make one way of hedging against that is making sure that your own federation is paying its own way. That's one way to making sure that the emergency measures aren't needed in the first place. That'd be a good idea. But again, one of the incentives problem is still there. Even in the hypothetical you give, you've got an anarchist federation declaring war on its enemies, or on its allies. And in case of a war, that's not a good thing. All it has to do really is make the case to say that if we're gone, you're next. And that is the reality. And that's, again, this is why it doesn't happen in anarchist societies. We've never seen it happen.
Well, but because most anarchist societies haven't lasted long, like in Mexico, Russia, and Spain.
Well, or even the anarchist societies which exist and have existed for about 50 odd years, it still hasn't happened.
Well, yes, but the ones that you mentioned are tolerated by the state. We're talking about an actual anarchist community with...
Exarchy is not tolerated by the state at all. They send in police... Exarchy, they send in police forces to try and root them out every year, and they just fight them off.
Oh, in Greece, you mean? Oh, right, the Greece one. You're right.
The Athens one. Yeah.
Right. But it's
It's
still
a famous. It's almost a war zone. It's not an ideal place to be.
No, I know. But what I'm saying is, it's still under the penumbra of the state, even if it's quote resisting it. I'm speaking of more of a situation where it's just considered unowned territory at this point. The example I gave previously, because the anarchists have asserted their independence, and the states are like, yeah, it's not worth our time to even claim hegemony over this region at the moment. So this is a different scenario. I think I'm just comparing different situations. I was looking at a more optimal maximalist anarchist position rather than one. Though, to what extent do you think the Kurds in Rojava and elsewhere have contributed to some solutions to this problem?
Well, they've abandoned the anarchist project altogether and resorted to conscription and taxation. And they
really?
weren't anarchists in the first place.
Though they never were anarchists, you said?
No, they were never anarchists in the first place. They were always quote unquote libertarian socialists, but they were never anarchists. They've always had a state.
Right.
Council communism, I think, is probably the most apt description for Rojava. And although they provided some case studies of cooperatives functioning quite nicely, a lot of liberties being respected, as opposed to what people were getting neighbouring theocracies. They provided some great examples of that, but in terms of the running of their society, or the political structure, it's still a government one. It's never not been one.
Okay, so then I guess the last question that I have for you then is, assuming the Anarchists Federation is able to achieve a level of independence and autonomy for itself wherever it's decided to establish itself, what would that look like on a day-to-day basis without having to worry about the state? I mean, they still have to interact with each other and go about their daily lives, but how would that look different from what we have today underneath the state?
You'd have a polycentric legal system of so if you talk about, like I mentioned before, the independent federations existing within similar territories, managing their own economies themselves. Well, not their own economies, but their workplaces and the interactions between members and between members of other federations and such. Those will develop into more specialized legal regimes. And those legal regimes will determine and arbitrate law, and those legal regimes would function more like consumer cooperatives. This is from Gary Chartier's book, Anarchy and Legal Order. So that's how the legal side would function. All
right. There's one question from the audience. What does ThoughtBat think about the Christian anarchism and Alexandre Christianopoulos' commentary on the gospel?
I'll be honest, I've not heard of it, so I can't give a comment.
All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for being a guest here, ThoughtBat. Where can people find your work?
Just on my channel on ThoughtBat. If you just search into Google ThoughtBat, you can search into Twitter ThoughtBat, and I'll be there. Just a comment before I go. A lot of the questions today have been, how would this happen? How would this happen? How would you envision this be sorted out? And I'm very aware that my answers have been very vague and very sort of non-definitive. And there's a reason for that, and that is down to the nature of anarchism to be very much against this idea of some authority just deciding some magical solution to every problem and then enforcing it on everyone. Our intention is to have the problems that society faces be managed by the people who are most directly in conflict with those problems. So, for example, I imagine airport security and airport traffic to be managed by airport workers. I imagine university policies to be determined by people who work at universities. It's going to be dependent on those people, and those people are going to be far more qualified in those fields than I am to give a comment on how those things are going to function. And the same applies to like military. I can't give you a manifesto for how an anarchist voluntary militia would function internally, because I'm not qualified to give that opinion. It sounds like a cop-out, but it's very much in line with the anarchist philosophy, is going to be determined by the people in the army, democratically determined by the people who are voluntarily part of that army. And they have to come up with a solution. I don't know what that solution is going to be exactly. And the most I can do is look at previous examples, and that's why I like to talk about Catalonia and Ukraine and what we did, what we got wrong, and what we did right, what we did well, what were the influences, and what were the factors contributing towards our demise. And to me, it doesn't seem to be a problem with not being able to function democratically or voluntarily or anything like that. It seems to be just a lack of capital, which is why gradualism, I think, is an important part of it. Gradualism is the gradual attaining of capital by anarchist organizations. And then they will do whatever they can with that capital. And in doing whatever they can with that capital, I have confidence, even though no hard proof or no fully devised plan, I have confidence that people will be able to find alternatives to Leviathan to solving those problems.
All right. Well, thank you again, ThoughtBat.
Thank you for having me. It's been an interesting conversation.
Yeah. Well, this is Todd Lewis of the President Folly Podcast.